The classroom at Coronado's Naval Special Warfare Training Center crackled with tension. The moment she stepped in, Dr. Elaine Thorne, a small, sharp-featured woman in pressed slacks and wire-rimmed glasses, looking more suited to a quiet campus than a battlefield, faced a room full of hardened SEAL recruits fresh off the obstacle course, and dripping with equal parts sweat and arrogance. And as whispers and smirks spread like wildfire through the rows, one muttered, "Wrong room, ma'am," while another chuckled, "We're here to fight." Not get a lecture from a librarian, but Thorne, unfazed, adjusted her papers calmly on the desk while the training officer announced her role. 4 hours a week, teaching asymmetric warfare theory, and the silence that followed was broken only by muffled laughter and eye rolls, especially from Merrick Davenport, the class leader and undisputed alpha, who finally spoke. "With respect, ma'am, theory doesn't stop bullets." And she simply met his challenge with a quiet nod before asking him to demonstrate his room-clearing procedure, which he executed flawlessly, at least in his mind, until she spent the next 10 minutes dismantling it, calmly and ruthlessly exposing every blind spot, every fatal angle, with the kind of precision that didn't come from books, but from having lived it. And as she spoke, her sleeve slipped just enough to reveal a thick scar wrapped around her wrist, before she quickly covered it again. Though one recruit, Calloway, noticed stand from that day on, something in the room began to shift, slowly at first, as Thorne didn't lead them through push-ups or endurance runs, but through minefields of cognitive error, anchoring bias, tunnel vision, overconfidence, all of it woven into real-world examples that hit too close to home, for men who believed muscle was enough. And while some began to listen, Davenport grew more restless, convinced strength and aggression were the only things that mattered until she coldly countered. "The strongest operator I ever knew died because he couldn't adapt." And that sentence, delivered with the weight of memory, froze the room, cracking the first layer of their assumptions. And by the time she introduced sensory manipulation drills, flashing lights, distorted sound, illusions that left even the toughest recruits stumbling, and swearing, the skepticism had turned to frustration. And when someone scrawled a crude cartoon of her on the whiteboard, Thorne erased it without a word. But Calloway approached her after class, apologizing quietly and admitting, "Some of us are starting to see the value." But Davenport owns the room, to which she simply replied, "Until he doesn't." And that day, as her exercises broke every team in the room, including Davenport's, she reminded them, "This was designed to fail. Your bodies are strong, but your minds are not." Triggering another outburst from Davenport, who called it all a waste of time. And her voice turned sharper as she said, "In Kandahar, I watched a man die because he thought just like you." And that word, "watched," stuck like shrapnel in every man's chest. And the following week, after dismantling another of Davenport's combat strategies, with chilling detail about an ambush in Fallujah, he stood and barked, "You don't learn that from textbooks." And she replied coolly, "No, but I saw it unfold 7 seconds in, and for dead because of that same maneuver." Her eyes hard and steady. And as she described the altered perception of your first kill colors sharpening, time slowing, Davenport snapped again, How would you know? But she didn't flinch, just referred them to the neuroscience section in their assigned reading. And it wasn't until he confronted her after class, furious and towering over her desk, accusing her of pretending to know warfare when she'd clearly never fought, that everything broke wide open. Because when he grabbed her throat and slammed her against the wall screaming that her theories were worthless in real combat, the classroom gasped and froze, several recruits witnessing what felt like the edge of chaos. And for a moment she didn't resist. Her eyes locked onto his. But then she moved too fast to follow, breaking his grip, dislocating his shoulder, and slamming him to the ground with clinical precision until he was face down beneath her knee, groaning in pain, just as Commander Blackwood entered the room, his expression unreadable as he said, "At ease, Major," and the word cracked like thunder through the stunned silence. Because that's when it all made sense. This wasn't a professor. They had been training with Major Elaine Thorne, call sign Wraith, Silver Star recipient, Purple Heart survivor, pioneer of cognitive warfare, and the only survivor of Operation Obsidian Shield. A name whispered in Black Ops circles and spoken of in hushed reverence. And suddenly the classroom that once reeked of mockery now stank of shame. And as the commander spelled out her credentials and rebuked their arrogance, Davenport sat stunned, arm limp, pride shattered. And Thorne, now calm again, dismissed the class with a quiet authority that didn't need yelling. And the men filed out in silence except for Calloway, who lingered with new understanding in his eyes, because Wraith wasn't an outsider. She was one of them, forged in fire. And the next day, training was suspended while Davenport faced review, his career hanging by a thread. And Thorne, meeting privately with Blackwood, admitted that yes, she could have subdued him without injury, but he needed to feel the cost of his arrogance. And that evening, she visited Davenport in the medical bay, where he sat defeated, convinced he was finished. But when she told him she hadn't signed off on his discharge yet, he was stunned, and she explained that while his actions were wrong, they came from loyalty misguided. Yes, but rooted in something leadership could be built on if he was willing to unlearn his assumptions. And when he asked, broken-voiced, what happened next, she offered him a choice: leave with your pride or stay and learn what real strength requires. And he chose to stay, to learn. And when class resumed, everything had changed. The sneers were gone, replaced by straight backs and attentive eyes. And even Davenport stood tall, sling and all, quiet and focused. And when someone asked if she really survived Obsidian Shield, she answered yes. Her team was ambushed, she was injured, but she extracted the intelligence. And when asked about her scars, she confirmed: captured in Kandahar, tortured, nerve damage permanent. And when Davenport quietly asked who the strongest operator was who couldn't adapt, she looked him in the eye and said, "Your father, Chief Garrett Davenport, saved my life twice. But when injury took his strength, he couldn't pivot, and it cost him everything." And the entire room fell into stunned silence, the pieces snapping into place. And in the weeks that followed, everything changed. Lectures turned into drills, blindfolded exercises, problem-solving under stress, tactical maneuvers sabotaged mid-mission, gear failure simulations. Every session designed to simulate chaos and force the recruits to think fast or fail hard. And as the class learned to adapt, to rely on each other, and shift leadership without ego. It was Davenport who led by example, volunteering even with one arm, acknowledging mistakes, and embracing every lesson with humility, and soon even the doubters followed. Because if the toughest among them could learn from her, they all could. And Blackwood watched from a distance as Thorne molded them not into muscle-bound machines, but thinkers, predators who could pivot mid-battle. And one night, as she shouted a complex scenario during a night drill, dominant arm injured. Hostiles at 3 o'clock. To civilians, what's your move? Davenport answered without flinching, offering a tactical response that relied not on brute force, but deception, terrain, and psychology, and Thorne nodded, barely but meaningfully, and by the time the final evaluation came, a 6-hour nightmare of exhaustion, broken equipment, leadership swaps, and mission puzzles, they didn't panic, they adapted. With Davenport yielding command when necessary and Calloway taking over when needed, until the team moved like one mind, every piece dynamic, every obstacle overcome, and when it ended, sweat-drenched and dirt-caked, Thorne told them, "Today you proved that strength alone is wasted without thought," and Blackwood, deeply impressed, announced her program would become a permanent part of SEAL training. With this class the first to set the benchmark, and 6 months later, as the recruits received their tridents, friends and family roaring with pride, Thorne stood in the shadows, content to watch quietly until Davenport's name was called, and Blackwood announced him as the highest-ranking graduate of her program, the one who set a new standard for leadership under fire. And when he searched the crowd and found her, he gave her a sharp, respectful nod that said everything, "Thank you for breaking me so I could be rebuilt." And as the ceremony ended, Thorne tried to slip away, but every graduate lined up along her path, offering silent salutes. No words, no speeches, just the unshakable respect that only experience could command. And at the end of the line, Davenport saluted and said, "Thank you, Major, for showing us that true strength isn't domination, it's adaptation." And as she returned the salute and walked away, Blackwood stopped her to say the program had outperformed every expectation: lower injuries, higher mission success, lives saved, and she replied simply, "Teaching them may be the most important mission of my life," then drove away under the setting sun, her scars tucked beneath her sleeves, knowing the generation she'd just trained would survive what her own team could not. Because now they knew what most never learned in time: strength might win a fight, but adaptation is what brings you home.